Today's webinar is going to be a hacker's perspective, tales from the trenches. Really what we're telling here are stories with regards to our experiences as offensive security here at Secure IT 360. And we're really just going to be talking about, lessons learned, right? And things that did work and maybe things that didn't work. And so the goal here is for you to come away from this webinar with some action items, right? With things that you can go take back to your organization or you can use in your personal lives or professional lives, to get some value. So first I want to introduce myself. Not a whole lot of crazy stuff here. My name is Brad Causey. I'm the VP of Offensive Security here at Secure IT 360. I've been doing cyber for a really long time, probably too long, I think, by some definitions. Really, I did most of my career in big banks, and that was a lot of fun. It was very challenging. Banks have a pretty interesting dynamic, if you will, from a cyber perspective. And so after I got out of the big bank stuff, I came out here to Secure IT 360, and now I have a team of pen testers, and this is kind of all we do. A big part of my life has been OWASP. If you're not familiar with that, that's the Open Web Application Security Project. It is a big passion of mine. It's a nonprofit organization that creates web application security resources to be used worldwide. And so they're really good about producing things that really kind of secure web apps for planet Earth, right? It's kind of the mission there, and it's really cool. So if you get a chance, check that out. I sat on the board of projects for a number of years. I spoke on behalf of OWASP at various conferences around the world. And today I'm less involved, but I am still involved in some of the web application projects like the cheat sheets and the web testing guide. So not really relevant to today, but fun stuff to talk about, the stuff that I actually like play with on the weekends, if you will. I spent some time as a sniper in the law enforcement community. I was in the Air Force for a short period of time. I am a rescue scuba diver, and I ride on and off-road motorcycles. So I'm a big fan of that, and some combination of those things, right? So let's get right into it. One of the really important things when I'm presenting is I want you guys to ask questions. I want you to jump in. There's a mechanism for you to ask questions during the webinar, and there's also going to be some time at the end for you to ask questions. So please interrupt me. Please, just throw that stuff in there. The interactivity is really important. And by the way, bonus points if you recognize the reference here. But we are going to tell stories. These are real stories that actually happened. Obviously, we're going to change some details, right? So we're going to move some things around. What we don't want to do is call people out or potentially cause a negative security impact to a client. So you'll notice intentionally there are some things missing, right? So we do different types of penetration testing here at Secure IT 360. One of the types of penetration testing that we do is internal penetration testing, right? And so in this particular case, we are working with a medium-sized retail client. And what we ended up attacking specifically is a scheduled task. And so I know it's a really busy slide, and it's all going to make sense as I kind of step through it, right? So as a matter of fact, let me grab a pen here. So we're looking at scheduled tasks. Okay. If you're not familiar with scheduled tasks, it is a primarily Windows mechanism that allows me to automate something. Usually I'm going to run a file or script, and it's going to happen at a certain time based on that schedule. Now, what makes this interesting is in most cases, you don't schedule just one task on a machine in your environment, right? You want to schedule that task across dozens, hundreds, thousands of machines. That's kind of the value of some of the automation. So you might put this in an image, or you might deploy this scheduled task using some kind of automated mechanism. And the challenge there is you need to be able to run that task with some level of privileges. It has to accomplish whatever the thing is that it wants to do. And so a lot of people fall into the trap of giving that scheduled task too much privilege, right? Too many rights, too much access or elevation that it doesn't need, right? In most cases, these batch files only need access to certain components, or these scheduled tasks rather, only need access to certain components of the operating system. And so it's a lot more work. but ideally we would want to see that right running as a minimum privilege. And so in this particular case, the scheduled task was running as domain admin, right? And that's kind of an easy button, right? Easy button meaning that if I give it domain admin privileges, it's going to work, right? Or it won't fail because of lack of permissions. And so domain admin is kind of an easy button. So talking about this scheduled task running as domain admin, and so that in and of itself creates some concerns for us. And so at that moment, though, if I don't have permissions to modify the scheduled task, maybe I can't really do anything with that, right? The downside, and this is kind of where things start to snowball out of control, right, is that the scheduled task was actually calling a batch file. All right, not necessarily scary yet, but it was sitting on a share out on the network, and domain users had full control. All right, so what does that mean? Well, that means that anyone who's a member of domain users, which by the way, by default is everyone, will be able to modify that batch file. So that means that I, as an attacker, can modify this file to do anything I want it to do. And the next time the scheduled task is executed, it's going to execute my file, right? So I can just kind of replace whatever the batch file is with the file of my choice, right? So we kind of see this downstream effect. So from an individual perspective, do I care you're running a scheduled task? No, man, that's great. Do I care that you're running it as domain admin? Yeah, I kind of do. But without some way to compromise that, again, not the end of the world. And so do I care that you're calling a batch file on a share? Again, not ideal. I understand. And so, it's the combination of all these elements that kind of roll together. And you're going to notice, by the way, that that's a trend throughout these. It's never this one thing. And that's an important delineation to have, because we get hyper focused in the IT world and even in the cyber world on, how good's my firewall? How good's my email filtering? How good are all these things? That's fantastic, man. But it's not usually going to be a single element that falls down when we're talking about a practical real world compromise. And so in this case, it was a combination of all of these things. So, all right, it happens. These kind of things will occur in your environment, no matter how good you are. How do we fix it, right? How do we identify it? How do we, implement best practices? Okay. And this is a tough one, right? The reason that this is tough is in most cases, and by the way, this is kind of the don't. Is it marking? Can you guys see my mark up there? This is kind of the not good enough, right? And this is kind of where we want to be. And so in the not good enough down here, an endpoint only assessment, right? Why is that not good enough? Well, the scheduled task is running on the endpoint, right? Running on the PC, but we're not going to get to see the batch file. We're not going to get to look at the domain user's permissions on the share. We wouldn't know that if we were only looking at the endpoint. You kind of have to look at the context that endpoint sits on, right? And so would EDR have caught this? Maybe, maybe not, because it's operating as intended. It's unlikely that EDR is going to catch this because the actual compromise is happening on the batch file on the share. And unless we put something in that batch file that the server holding the share is going to scan and then identify as malicious, EDR is not going to catch this, right? It might catch the behavior of modifying a network file or something like that, but I think that's a stretch depending on your EDR. It's not good enough, right? Network intrusion detection, not good enough, right? All it's looking for is anomaly-based traffic. Keep in mind, everything you see up here is operating as intended by design, okay? So would host-based intrusion detection systems work? Not really, no. Unless we execute something in that batch file that calls one of these, right? If I execute, something malicious in the batch file and it makes it an evil call out to the internet, yeah, okay, we might pick those things up. And that's kind of one thing I'm going to touch on later is that stage 2. We can't always catch stage 1. We want to catch it in stage 2 because they're going to do something malicious eventually, right? And so finally, it's not just scheduled tasks. It's services running as elevated privileges, accessing things that are modifiable by users. It's logon scripts that can be susceptible as well. So we kind of talked about the not good enough. Let's talk about where you can go good here, right? Unfortunately, you're going to have to do some manual review, right? And so, first of all, you need to have a gold image, right? You can't evaluate your standard configuration if you don't have a standard configuration. So have that gold image out there. Look at it, with the eyes of a penetration tester, right? And then MITRE is a really good resource for this. And so why MITRE? What is MITRE? MITRE is an attack framework. What I really love about them is that they kind of have these tactics, techniques, procedures used by the bad guys that are proven out in the real world to be dangerous, and you can follow that flow. And we use it as a framework of reference for things like purple teams. We use it as a framework of reference for penetration testing reporting, because it allows you to be as general as you want to be or as specific as you want to be. And an example of that is looking at the configuration of these various components that we've talked about. And in this case, what we're looking at is, if I recall, it's the logon script, or maybe no, it's a scheduled task. And T1037 is actually kind of the more broad, high level category, and 001 is specifically talking about modifying tasks. So you can dig into this and be as specific as you want. If this is something that's of concern to you, go pull up MITRE T1037, look at all of the attack techniques, and then work backwards from that into your gold image and manually review those different components, right? Here are a couple of really cool tools that you can use. Some of these, by the way, may get flagged as evil by your EDR, so keep that in mind. Special note out to Script Century, which was written by Spencer on my team, and he's an absolute wizard, and it's specific to logon scripts. So check out that if that's a concern to you. Okay, excellent. Let's get rid of my pen and let's move to the next one. Very good. This is also an internal penetration testing case. This one's a little bit more straightforward, and also absolutely blew our minds, right? And so this is a regional financial institution. What got compromised? Everything. The whole domain in one step, right? And so, we come in, we log in Monday morning. There's a tool called Ping Castle that kind of analyzes Active Directory from a security perspective and best practice perspective, and it spit out something super scary, right? And so we're kind of freaked out. Surely this is a false positive. And what it told us is that I want to say it was the everyone group, or the domain users group, had full control over the entire domain. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that anyone on the network can modify any aspect, including group memberships, including attributes, including organizational units, whatever it is, with full control. I can modify anything I want. So I can just add myself into the domain admins group, or I can remove everybody else. And so, it's kind of the one step to complete control. And so it was really surprising to us. And so it's, usually it's not Monday morning at 8 a.m. when we fully compromise a target, right? It's a little bit later in the week. We've built attack plans. We've done all this reconnaissance, spent tons of hours. It's not usually, hey, the first tool we run results in completely owning that domain. However, why are we talking about this story when it's not necessarily as sexy as some of the other ones? Because you can figure this out for free with very little effort. And as easy as it was for us to find a way to completely compromise the domain, same for you, right? You do the same thing. So how would you, let's talk about what's not good enough, right? Let's talk about detection when it comes to this. Kind of a similar story as before, and this is a recurring theme in internal penetration testing, is this stuff's operating as intended. It was designed to work this way. So it's not surprising that no one has any idea that it's going on. It's not surprising that it hasn't popped up. I have a couple of examples down here: EDR, MDR, XDR. If you don't know what those are, it's fine. Most people don't. It's not super important. But basically, all of your normal detection mechanisms, they're not going to pick this up, right? And so again, it's operating as intended. So any normal detection is not necessarily possible. Now, again, we talked about stage one, right? Stage one here is like, oh, I have full control of the domain. There really isn't anything I changed. I just came in owning the network. Stage two is where we can catch people. And this is kind of, catch the secondary step. And that is, the most logical thing to do if I'm not an experienced attacker is to put my account in domain admins, right? You should be monitoring that. That is where something like MDR is going to pick it up, right? Like, whoa, we don't normally see changes to domain admins. Why am I seeing this now? And who is this random user, who yesterday was, a teller? And so suddenly now they're a domain admin. That doesn't make sense. So we're looking for that secondary step. But how can you prevent this? How can you keep something like this from happening in the first place? First of all, a manual review of Active Directory. All right, seems simple, right? It's really not. Active Directory is very complicated. Even, myself as an MCSE, we have several Active Directory experts. We don't know everything, right? In fact, there are new Active Directory exploits and attacks that come out very frequently. And so it's just such a massive animal that, yeah, you can do a manual review of Active Directory, but without some supporting tools, it's going to be really tough. So what are those supporting tools? So there are two here that I would encourage you to check out. They are both free and they are both very, very good. So Ping Castle and Purple Knight both do a similar job of going out and performing this analysis in your Active Directory environment to determine where those misconfigurations, those misplays are within your environment, right? And so this is something that if you haven't done, absolutely need to do this as soon as possible, is just go run these tools. Go see what you find. You might be surprised to find out that, your IT, I'll tell you another one real quick side story. Similar case, right? The IT service desk group had full control over the domain. And at some point, someone had accidentally drugged the everyone group into the IT service desk group. So it was a little bit more complicated than what you see in this scenario, but it was the same end result. And it was that one misconfiguration, which didn't seem all that dangerous. Why would I care if everyone was in the IT service desk group? Well, I care because that nested membership downstream was pretty dangerous. And so you're going to have a hard time figuring that stuff out manually. Ping Castle and Purple Knight will help you do that. All right. External penetration test, right? So this is a fun story. There's a couple of these that are really fun. And so we're working with a national insurance provider, and they were kind of broken out into like regional groups, I guess is what you would call it. And so the goal was to see how far we could get, right? Compromise client information, access the internal network, et cetera. And so what we ended up gaining access to were several client accounts. But the way that we did it is pretty cool. This is where thinking like a hacker comes into play, right? And so we were looking at the footprint of the organization, and we found this access portal. And it was where you could log in and you could look at like your insurance bill and your historic like account changes and all that. You guys are probably familiar with that type of portal, right? It's kind of like an online banking portal, but for your insurance. And so what we needed was a username and a password to log in. And obviously we don't have that, right? There's not, a repository of those for this particular application. So we're like, okay, how can we figure out a good way to get in? Well, naturally, one of the things we first look at is the password reset. And the password reset is valuable for a number of reasons. First of all, the password reset is valuable if the information it gives us contributes to the compromise, right? And what I mean by that is if I put in a password or rather a user that doesn't exist, does it say, hey, that user account doesn't exist? Or does it say, attempt failed? Because if it says the user account doesn't exist, now I know if it did exist, it would tell me. We would call that a user enumeration vulnerability, right? And so one of the things that we pretty quickly realized is that there were two things that you needed to reset the password. And it was the zip code for the account, and it was the account number. And so I don't know if you guys have ever paid close attention to health insurance and different types of account numbers, but even banks follow a certain pattern. The problem is knowing what that pattern is, and we had no idea. And so we knew we needed a zip code. We knew this particular regional portal or whatever. It even said in the name of the portal, it was like, oh, this is an Arizona portal. And we're like, cool. So now we know, by the way, what pool of zip codes to pull from. So we went out and we just did a quick search, like, hey, what are the most populous zip codes in Arizona? Boom, top 5, easy, right? And so now we have half of the information. The other half of the information we don't have. And that's the account number. And what we wanted was the account number. So I just called the 1-800 number on the website. And I was like, hey, I have my little notebook in front of me, and I usually write down all of my account numbers. But I don't know which one of these is my insurance number. Can you tell me what the pattern is or the format is of the number so that I can figure this out? And the lady was super helpful. And she's like, oh yeah, honey, don't worry. All it is, blah, 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 blah. So you see here, I've got an example, the XYZ00123ABC. And she even told me, she was like, the first 3, because we're in Arizona, are always XYZ. The last 3, because we're only providing whatever insurance it was, is always going to be ABC. And so your number is going to be unique. It's going to be the 4 digits before the ABC. That's your account number. And I was like, boom, beautiful. And you can, ask questions and stuff like that. But she basically gave me everything I needed. Now, all I need to do is write a script that combines zip codes with this number and varying those 4 digits. And you can imagine, by the way, there's not that many combinations. It's going to be about 10,000 combinations of this times every one of these. So now we're looking at, what is that? 50,000 combinations, which sounds like a lot. In the computer world, 50,000 is nothing. So we just start hammering the application. We wrote a script. The client actually called us, by the way, and they said, hey, our upstream provider for the portal is asking if anything's going on. And we're like, nope, everything's fine. We're good. And they kept processing everything. And so what we realized, we started getting interesting responses back. And what we realized is if it already had an online profile, it would ask you to provide the email address. Well, man, there's no way I'm going to figure that out, right? But if you had never logged in, it would ask you to provide an email to set up your profile. So as you can imagine, we started getting dozens of these that were popping up, right? Of the correct combination of the zip code, the correct combination of the account number. And then so we would just, type that in manually from our script, and then it would take us to a page. We'd put in a bogus email, and then boom, we just started pulling up insurance documents. And these insurance documents were like the establishment of the insurance. So it was like Social Security numbers, account numbers to auto draft payments from, like everything you can imagine that to steal somebody's identity, including address that was insured, all kinds of crazy stuff. So a little bit of ingenuity, thinking outside the box, took us here. And so, now of course they've patched all this, everything, works much better. If I recall correctly, if they don't have a profile now, they have to provide a phone number that matches the phone number on file. And that's an important thing for you guys to think about. If you're in a position where you have authority over designing authentication, especially when we're talking about identity, is they need to provide something that's not public that you already have, right? Combining account number with zip code and phone number, that's reasonable for what these guys are protecting. But long story short, here are some things you can do, right? Rate limiting. I shouldn't be able to send 50,000 requests from a single IP address. That's not normal. And so we want to look for anomalies like that, right? And so it was really awesome that their upstream provider saw it, made the call, but it was not awesome for them to just be like, yeah, okay, it's fine. And so, that is indicative of something not cool going on. Excuse me. This company did not suddenly get 50,000 new clients, right, in the span of like 5 minutes. It's not how things work. So anomalies like that, you need to be in a position to catch those. Application monitoring and alerting. Same thing, right? The rate limiting is something that can be implemented at multiple levels. You can implement that at the network. You can implement that at the load balancer. You can implement that within the application source code itself. CAPTCHAs are amazing things, right? That's a really good example of a way to defeat what we were doing, or at least slow us down to a point where it's not practical anymore. So yeah, let's also implement some application monitoring and alerting, right? Let me give you an example of what that might look like. Why would the same IP address log into multiple client profiles? Very unlikely, right? And now you might say, well, what if they're all behind a proxy? What if three students from a university tried to log in on the same? That's fine. They're all going to have different browser fingerprints. It would be very unlikely for the same browser fingerprint to log in from the same IP address 50,000 times, right? Or a dozen times on different profiles. Another thing to do is look at conditional access, right? Am I logging in from a geographical area that is within 500 miles of the zip code that's insured? Now, are there going to be anomalies? Yeah, of course. But combining all of these things together, all we're trying to do is not make one single, wall the attacker can't possibly get over. But if you build enough little walls, it's going to become so inconvenient and cumbersome, they're going to move on to the next person. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here. And I already mentioned the known channels. So that's always a fun one. This one is absolutely similar, but crazy. And it's crazy because of the number of things that we had to glue together to make it work. And so we were working with a college, pretty big college, and we managed to go from an external penetration test to domain admin. And if you guys aren't familiar with what that process looks like, that is unusual. It is a statistical outlier for us. We don't typically do that, right? Because if we can do it, somebody else can too, and they probably already have. So let's talk about this, right? So they were using M365 for student emails, but they had an on-prem federated Active Directory environment. And what that means basically is that their Active Directory environment lives on site, right? It's on physical or virtual servers that are at the university. And in a lot of cases, we'll have like a split deployment where there'll be, Azure AD or something like that as well, but not important. The important thing is they had on-prem Active Directory, right? Now, if the student has an M365 account, then that means that there is some type of identity behind that identity management system. In this case, it was the on-prem Active Directory. So they were kind of sharing Active Directory with staff and other folks, right? Which isn't huge. It's not perfect, but by itself and done well, it can be okay. So one of the things that we do on external penetration tests is we do a dark web search. And what this is we're going out looking for compromised credentials. And what we found is that a prior student from 6 years ago, red flag, 6 years ago, had her student account compromised, not her student account, but had the username and password. So she used her college account to go create an account on a third-party website that was compromised, and the password was disclosed. Now, what are the chances that that same username and password is going to work back on the student's M365 environment, right? Well, in this case, it's 100% because that's exactly what we did. And so we realized pretty cool, right? We could log into that student's email. And if we can log into their email, we probably do a lot of stuff. Well, one of the things that this college had done that's really smart is that the internal accounts in Active Directory were not a one-to-one to the M365 where you log in with an email, right? So instead of logging in with an email, you had to know your student ID. Well, we didn't know her student ID, right? And it was not an easy thing to figure out. And so as we kind of parked that and we continued down the penetration testing road. And later on, we found this password reset portal, like a student reset portal, self-service, whatever you want to call it. And if you failed the password reset enough times, you can kind of see what it would look like. It would tell you, hey, here's the 1-800 number to the help desk. Give them your student ID, and it is, boom, this. All right, cool. So now we know this student's Active Directory username and password, and we know the student's M365 email and password. So what are we going to do with it though? Well, eventually we ended up finding an old remote access portal to a lab environment. And it was so students could log in and work on their labs remotely. And the username and password that you had to use was the student ID and then their Active Directory password, which we had. And so we were able to log in. And what we very quickly realized is that the system was sharing an Active Directory environment with the rest of the college. And we were able to Kerberos. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically just extracting service account SPNs out of Active Directory, and we cracked the domain admin password. And so this entire process from start to finish was probably a day, less than a day. And so, you can imagine the number of things that have to be lined up for this to work correctly, right? First of all, we have to find a 6-year-old account. Why wasn't it disabled? Right? That comes to, is one of the things we talked about. Like, whoa, that student was out processed a long time ago. Why is their account still active? Now this is a tough challenge for colleges. I understand that. So I'm not picking on them at all. But the student had to have a dark web hit with a compromised password that worked. We could have probably gotten this password through password guessing, spraying, credential stuffing, whatever. And then we had to have a way to find out we had to convert to internal account numbers, which we were able to do, or usernames rather, which we were able to do by finding this portal. And then the third thing that had to line up is we had to, find remote access that didn't have MFA, right? I'm going to tell you how to bypass that in just a second. But first of all, let's bump that password complexity up, right? That's really important because passwords, I care less that you reset your password often and more that your password is so insanely complex I can't possibly brute force it or I can't possibly crack it. So reset it less, but make it more complicated and really longer. Length is key when it comes to passwords. And put MFA, right? So a couple of things here. First of all, I wouldn't be able to log into M365 if you had MFA. I wouldn't be able to log into this portal if you had MFA. And, if you put MFA around the password reset, I wouldn't have been able to get deep enough into the process to get the user ID. So MFA is, in 2024, MFA is kind of, a minimum. It's the entry level into creating a secure environment. It's not even the end game anymore. It used to be that if you had MFA, you were awesome. Nowadays, MFA is the starting point. So we're really far behind if we don't have MFA across our entire footprint. Okay. So this is web application pen testing. This one is a number of years old, but it's a really fun one to talk about. We were working with a large corporation here in the US, and the goal of the application was that if you give blood and you're an employee of this corporation, then you would go log your that you gave blood, and then they would give you a gift card. And if you gave blood as often as you could, you would get more gift cards, and you kind of build up points. Basically, it was like a point system, and then you use the points to buy the gift card, and that way you could save up for like an entire year and get like $100 gift card for giving blood. It was a really cool idea. And the problem is it was an external website, so it was not inside the organization, so it was accessible from the internet. And it was a self-register. And it was supposed to be employees only. In fact, it even asked you for an employee ID to go along with your employee email and all this other good stuff. But it was not validating it, which means I could just make up an email and make up an employee ID, and it would let me register my account. I think we actually even use like Gmail accounts. We just had in the string the name of the company, because it's looking for user@domain.com, but the way that they were implementing validation was they were just doing a string search to see if corporation name existed in the string, and they were just assuming that would be part of the domain. So we would just do, bradcorporation@gmail.com, and it would pass the test and allow us to create an account. So not great validation there. And zero validation of the employee ID, because you would have stopped us right there, right? If you had to have a truly internal email and you were enforcing valid employee IDs. And by the way, send me a validation link to my employee ID that I have to click on. You guys have seen those, right? That's a really good mechanism for ensuring that you're dealing with the right people. Long story short, they didn't have those things. So when you're in the app, you create an entry for like an instance of having given blood. And so it was a where, when, how much, blah, 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 whatever. And then, every month they would kind of bulk process the gift cards and send them out. And, I have listed like 25 per unit, et cetera. The problem is when you created the entry, they weren't validating the input fields. And so we use a technique called SQL injection. And at a fundamental level, what SQL injection does is it allows me to kind of take control of the execution of the database behind the application, which means I can manipulate the data, I can modify the data, I can delete it if I want to. And so what we pretty quickly figured out was a mechanism that allowed us to, instead of when we created a single entry, there was some validation around you can only create one entry every X number of weeks, right? So like they were kind of like, you can't give blood 32 times in a day. We're trusting you to be honest with us. Well, we found a way around that, is that since we could control the execution of the data query, we just created like 1 million entries. And so, we were talking, it was something like $25 million that we were going to get shipped to us in gift cards. Obviously, hopefully some validation would occur, right? Before that happened. And so we ended up like pausing. We called the client. We're like, hey, please don't send us $25 million in gift cards. But we found a way to kind of manipulate the system. And as a side note on this particular application, we were testing in a production environment because they didn't have a test or a dev environment, which is a big no-no, right? And we made an exception to our policy. We're like, hey, normally we don't test in production, but you guys are telling us that it's okay and giving us permission. And so we did. And at one point, I think we reached some kind of critical entry within a table or something, and we corrupted the database file, which means it died. And turns out they didn't have any backups. So we took it offline forever. It never came back. But the real moral of the story here is, I mentioned earlier, thinking like a hacker, right? First of all, user validation. I've already kind of mentioned what you can do to get around that, right? Input validation. I need to make sure that if I'm asking you for a date, that you're not giving me a SQL query. I need to make sure that if I'm expecting a zip code, I should get a 5-character number value only string from you, right? I should not get a paragraph of words and special characters. And then finally, logic testing, right? How logical is it for me to have give blood 1 million times in a day? I don't know if I would survive that. Probably not, right? I don't know if I'd survive like 3. But the point is, implementing some basic logic testing here might have helped them. I mean, they'd have to fix the SQL injection too. But the point is that, we should implement some basic logic and function control around the application. So social engineering, and this is, I mentioned to you that bypassing MFA. This is one of the ways to bypass MFA in an environment. Unfortunately, it requires a little bit of fun social engineering. And so this is one of the things that we also do. And so, step number 1, Jordan is one of the pen testers on my team. We use her a lot because females get away with things, right? And I'm going to explain the whole story and why that makes sense. But we use her for a lot of social engineering engagements. And so first, we're going to cyber stalk the target. So in this particular case, it was a national MSP, which is just a service provider for like technology services. And what did we get? What did we actually compromise? Well, in this case, our goal, and anytime we do a social engineering engagement, we focus on a specific goal. And so we don't want to have it too broad. But in this case, they were like, we want you to take over one of our customers' accounts. And so we had them create a bogus account in that environment for us to target. And so We cyber stalked the target. We figured out, who they were. And so like in this case, if we were targeting Jordan, we would create a bogus Gmail account. And in this case, jnatter123@gmail.com. And then we wanted to time when we called the support services. Because remember, we're trying to take over Jordan Natter's real account, like at this company. And so we realized that if you call during after hours, you went to an answering service. Now, why is that important? Well, anytime you receive information from a trusted source, you are more apt to trust that information than if you receive it from an untrusted source. Well, an answering service is a trusted source. And so we're going to use that answering service to gain the trust of the IT support staff. So we called in, we gave them the hacker cell phone number, or in this case, Jordan called in, she gave her personal cell phone number and said, hey, I'm really, it's an emergency. I need to get I can't get access to my stuff. My boss is going to fire me. I'm new. And so you kind of give them this whole story. That story then received by the answering service is passed on to the on-call IT support person. Now, why is that important also? Well, we're doing this during off hours, right? How many of you guys love to work at 10 o'clock at night? Nobody does, right? The most important thing you can do is get whatever that is done so you can go back to bed or go back to whatever it is that you're doing. We like to leverage that urgency. And so now they've received this message from the answering service. They call Jordan back. So I'm literally like playing a baby crying in the background and she's freaking out and, the baby's sick. You really got to get this figured out. And so they ended up resetting her password on her regular email account, and by the way, the reason I have her Gmail sitting up there is because we were actually sending messages to the support staff via email as well. Like, hey, this is my personal email. Can you work with me over this email while I'm trying to get access to my work email? And since the names match, we even actually made the signatures match too, where the signature in the Gmail email had some of the same information that we thought might be in her professional email. And so we're connecting all these dots for the IT support staff. And long story short, they reset the email account. And we knew they had MFA, right? And she's like, okay, cool. And so you hear just type. Oh no, it's asking me for MFA. And I don't think I ever set that up. And so they were like, oh yeah, totally. Here, do you want me to reset your MFA too? And she's like, yeah, just to the phone number you already have for me. So again, we're letting them use information provided to them by the answering service, which was her personal cell phone number, not the target. And so long story short, we got our MFA reset and applied to the new cell phone number, and we got our username, which, by the way, we had wrong in this particular case. They corrected it for us. We thought it was first name dot last name at company.com, and it was like first letter of first name, full last name at company.com. And they're like, oh, that's why you're not logging in. You got the wrong username. Here's the right username. So we literally had nothing right when we called these folks, and they talked themselves into giving us MFA and full set of credentials to log into this particular account. So what can we take away from this story? Well, one of the things is you have to remember that your IT staff, and I'm not just talking about phone support, I mean help desk, I mean network engineers. These people have a tremendous amount of access and privileges within your organization. They are the front line from a security perspective. And even though they are not necessarily security practitioners, they still have that level of responsibility and that level of risk and impact should they not do the right thing. And so it's our job as security folks to help educate them. It's our job to give them the tools to be successful. Did they have a good process? I don't know. If they did, they weren't following it. How can we do better at that? Well, we can have internal discussions. Hey guys, make sure you're following the process. Hey folks, let's step through that process, right? And maybe we use checklists like, hey, I want to see that you checked off all 5 of these steps. One of those might be calling the boss of the person if they don't have access to anything and verifying that they are who they are. And then finally testing them, which is what we were doing, by the way. And so I think in my opinion, we set, and by we, I mean the client kind of set their IT support staff up for failure, because instead of doing the they're the front line. Let's educate them. Let's give them the tools to succeed. We kind of started with the, hey, we just totally compromised one of your clients and it's your fault. And now you got to do better, right? Why don't we start from the let's do better first? Let's go through our processes. Let's look at our procedures. Let's test those things. Then let's do a social engineering pen test and see, if the things that we've built work, as opposed to breaking in first and trying to build up processes after. So fun story. Social engineering is super fun and kind of unfair, I think, in a lot of cases. Speaking of unfair, last story. This is pretty close to social engineering, but we also do physical penetration testing. One of the things that we found to be tremendously successful is there's a concept called cover for action, right? And cover basically meaning like, why are you doing the thing that you're doing? We have found these Terminex uniforms to be wildly successful because where is a place that you would see a exterminator and think, wow, you shouldn't be here, right? There's not really a place. Pretty much anywhere you see them, you can justify their presence, right? If it's in a closet, if you're in the kitchen, if you are walking around, a power plant, well, they need bug control too, right? So I really like these, and it's also as an added benefit, you can carry around things like clipboards and big jugs full of liquid, and it's okay. Nobody's going to question you. And so, you have this kind of built-in, cover for carrying things like tools. And, we usually hide our tools in our clipboard, or we'll modify the actual like core pump component of these sprayers to house tools like pry bars and bypass tools. So it's just a really neat, it kind of fits all the check boxes. So in this particular case, we were brought in by a critical infrastructure group, and they really didn't give us a lot other than what we call flags. And a flag for us on physical pen testing is kind of like a goal, right? And in this particular case, the goal was to, first of all, just gain access to the facility because it had razor wire access controlled fences and gates and all, like all this crazy stuff. You look at it from the outside and you're just like, there's no way I'm getting in there, right? And so, that was kind of step one, get in there. And if you can get in there, see what you can do, right? Can you gain access to the SCADA systems, right? Can you gain access to the network? Can you, just see what you can get into, kind of trouble you can create. So, naturally we're like, yeah, we can create trouble. So step number one, we go out, we look at Google Maps. And we kind of identify like entry points. We're looking at the distances between, structure, like other structures and that structure. In a lot of cases, you can get close enough to something that you're 5 steps away. You just walk to it. And so in this case, it was in the middle of an open field, surrounded by acres and acres of grass, no trees, and this huge fence and access control gates. And we're like, shoot, man, there's no way just from a Google Map reconnaissance that we're going to be able to figure out what an attack plan looks like. So we went out, we did physical reconnaissance, right? So now we like park across the street, and we're eating Cheetos and we look like, NYPD stakeout thing. And so, but what we noticed is, at 7 a.m. and at 3 p.m., most of the employees would come and go, right? So they'd show up at 7. That was their work schedule, 7 to 3. And so we realized also that if you were exiting the facility, the gate opened automatically for vehicles leaving. But if you're approaching from the front, the gate, you had to put in a PIN code. And so we counted, and it took like 40 seconds from the time the gate started to open till the gate started to close. And so we realized from the position we had parked at, it took like 20 seconds to drive to the gate. And we're like, wow, that's a huge window. 20 seconds, a lot of time. So we literally parked around the corner in a position where we could see the approach to the gate, but they couldn't see us. And so we waited until somebody started driving out, and we just drove right in. We even waved at them as we went by, and we just kind of passed each other, and went in through into the facility. So we literally pull up, and a big part of this engagement or these engagements is to look the part and be confident, right? Act like you're supposed to be there. Be polite, professional, think of yourself like, hey, I'm a Terminex exterminator, and this is what I do. And so, we even, by the way, like we'll be walking up and down the hallway, we'll be having conversations about, hey, I see moisture over there. That looks like a potential problem. And so I'm going to make sure I spray that. Or, hey, make sure you get that corner. I see where, there's a potential for bugs. So it's like we'll have real conversations and we'd go out and we do research. Like when we went into this particular engagement, we had researched the kind of chemicals that would be used in this particular facility because it was a specialized facility and you can't just use any exterminating fluid in any facility. There's actually a rhyme and reason. Like if there are pets, you have to use pet safe. And so we actually had researched all of that and we could tell you, what the mix ratio was of the poison to water. And so like we really were acting the part. Turns out none of that was necessary because nobody said anything to us other than hello. But we basically walked into the facility and it was interesting because there were all these high security doors everywhere and they had these signs. You can actually see like it was this kind of sign on those doors, keep door closed at all times, on an open door that was propped open with a piece of wood. And we're just like, cool. So we literally walked through the entire facility top to bottom. There was not a single room we didn't gain access to. And of course, we're passing by all these video surveillance in progress. Video surveillance is amazing, but it's only good if somebody's watching it and has the ability to act on it. And so, of course, everything we did was on camera. In fact, the client, after it was all over, said, yeah, man, we went back and watched the surveillance video and it happened exactly like it said it did, which, by the way, we actually wear video pens on these engagements for our protection and the clients, but everything we did was recorded on HD 1080p. So, but they had it on surveillance as well. And so, there are a couple of things at play here, right? And we ended up touching every SCADA interface, plugging USB drives into networks. Like we completely hit every flag over and beyond. And I'm going to talk about keys, and that's really going to be kind of my last thing before we start to wrap up. But humans are the key, right? It doesn't matter how good your physical controls are. Somebody with a 45 cents wedge can stick it under that door, and that door is no longer an access control mechanism, right? And that's what happened here is all these doors were propped open. It helped that it was beautiful weather. I think this was like around it was like fall, perfect weather. So yeah, I mean, they had a cross breeze going through the whole facility. It was really nice. And we appreciated them leaving all the doors wedged open for us. Right. So that's really important, right? Is humans are the key. You need to talk to your folks and have them understand that they are that first line of defense, right? Human behavior is going to compromise an organization before any technology stack will, especially in modern days, right? That wasn't true in 1998. It is true now. And so humans are the key. They need to think in a security mindset. I think these guys have been working there for so long that, they see people walking through the facility. They don't even say a word, right? We were prepared. Like we had forged work orders and we had names and phone numbers and stuff, but nobody ever challenged us, Now we've had physical pen testing engagements where somebody was like, hey, I don't think you're supposed to be here. Show me your work order. Who called you here? Why are you here? And we love those people. We're like, hey, good job. We usually take a screenshot of their face and put it in the report. And we're like, that person absolutely gave us a run for our money. And so in this case, didn't happen at all. And so, you need to be thinking like a bad guy. Look at those physical controls from how would I break into that? Right. One of the other things that I thought was really fascinating about this facility, it was an older facility, probably made in the 60s or 70s. And they still had those old flip out glass panel windows at ground level. So, if the facility was not occupied, you're pick up a rock and throw it through the window and you're in. Right. And that mattered in this particular facility. Like you didn't need to ever have anybody in there. So long story short, you need to think like a bad guy. How would I break in? If you're going to implement these physical controls, make sure your humans aren't bypassing them and make sure they're good security controls, right? Physical security is not magic. It's not like IT security, which is kind of complicated and crazy. Physical security is really not. The last thing I want to throw out there is keys are like passwords. On almost every physical engagement we go on, for some reason, we find keys. We find them on people's desks, unsupervised. We find them indoors, like literally hanging indoors. We find them all over the place. Understand that keys are exactly like passwords. I can take that key and make it mine. Or if I want to be super slick, I can literally go back to my truck in the parking lot and I can cut a match for that key. In fact, I can take a picture of the key laying on the desk, never touch it, and go cut a match for that key and then use it anywhere I want to. And so I think a lot of people kind of forget how important keys are in the physical security world, but they are very, very important. And keep that in mind. All right, wrap up. So, I'm going to kind of click through these last couple of slides. This is basically what we do here at Security 360, but I'd like to hear some questions from you guys. Throw me some questions. We got a few more minutes before we got to wrap up at 12. What do you got? Oh, that reminds me, cybersecurity, the cyber threat perspective. We have a podcast. In fact, this will end up being an episode of the podcast this week. But we talk about all kinds of cool stuff in the cyber world. So if you get a chance, that's what this QR code's for. Go check out the podcast. It's actually, really good. And we're putting out, a new episode every Wednesday. So something to check out for sure. All right, folks. I'm going to hang on for a few more minutes just in case there are questions, but that's all I have for you. Thanks for attending, and we'll see you guys on the next one.